Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Everyday English Channel with Tom and Kate. We're really happy to have you with us today.
Yes, thanks for being here again. And honestly, today's topic is something that makes a lot of people nervous in English: phone calls. I think even people who feel comfortable speaking English face to face sometimes become less confident on the phone. When you can't see the other person, the conversation feels different.
That's true. Phone conversations can feel more difficult because you only have the voice. You can't see facial expressions or gestures, so people often worry more about understanding correctly. And what's interesting is that phone calls are usually very direct. People don't speak for a long time before getting to the point.
Yes, especially in everyday situations. Most phone calls start with very simple expressions. People say things like, "Hi, it's Kate," or "Hey, how are you?" or "Are you free to talk for a minute?" These are extremely common and very natural.
In my case, I usually start phone calls in a clear and structured way. I like immediately knowing why I'm calling. So I might say something like, "Hi, it's Tom. I'm calling about tomorrow's meeting," or "I just wanted to ask you something quickly." I think expressions like "I'm calling about" or "I just wanted to" are very useful because people use them constantly on the phone.
I'm more casual when I call someone, especially friends or family. I usually start with small talk first. I might say, "Hey, what are you doing?" or "Sorry, am I disturbing you?" before talking about the real reason for the call. And actually, "Am I disturbing you?" is a very natural expression when you want to check if the person is available.
Another thing people often say is this a good time? Especially before longer conversations. That's a useful expression because it sounds polite and relaxed at the same time.
Yes, and people also apologize a lot on the phone, even for small things. Someone might say, "Sorry for calling so late," or "Sorry, I think the connection is bad." Phone conversations have many small expressions like that which become automatic over time.
That's true. And one thing that happens constantly during phone calls is checking if the other person can hear you properly. People say things like, "Can you hear me?" or "You're cutting out," or "The line is bad." These expressions are extremely common now, especially with mobile phones or internet calls.
Yes, and I think "you're cutting out" is particularly useful because people use it all the time during bad connections. Sometimes you suddenly stop hearing part of the sentence, and people immediately say, "Sorry, you were cutting out for a second."
Another thing I notice is that people often repeat information more on the phone than in face-to-face conversations. Because the sound is not always perfect, someone might say, "Sorry, can you say that again?" Or, "I didn't catch that."
Yes, "I didn't catch that" is very natural English. It simply means you didn't hear or understand correctly. And honestly, native speakers say that constantly too. It's completely normal during phone conversations.
Another common situation is when someone calls unexpectedly.
Yes, especially nowadays, because many people prefer messages.
Exactly. So when someone suddenly calls, people often answer with a little surprise in their voice. They might say, "Hey, everything okay?" Or, "Oh, I wasn't expecting your call."
And even those small reactions are useful because they make the conversation sound natural and authentic.
Yes. And what's interesting is that phone calls usually use very simple English. The challenge is not the vocabulary itself, it's understanding quickly and reacting naturally.
Exactly. And that's why practicing these small expressions is so useful.
One thing that changes a lot during phone calls is the tone people use depending on who they are speaking to. The way you talk to a close friend is completely different from the way you speak to a colleague, a customer, or someone you don't know very well. For example, if I call a friend, I might start very casually with something like, "Hey, what's up?" or "What are you doing?" But if I call someone for work, I become much more direct and organized. I would probably say, "Hi, this is Tom calling," followed by the reason for the call. And actually, this is a very common structure on the phone. People say, "Hi, this is Tom," or "This is Kate from the office."
Yes, and I think phone calls for work often sound more formal at the beginning, but then become more relaxed once the conversation starts. For example, someone might begin with, "Hello, I'm calling regarding tomorrow's appointment." But after a few minutes, the conversation becomes much more natural. And honestly, many people feel nervous making work phone calls in English because they're afraid of not understanding everything immediately.
That's true, especially because phone conversations move quickly. There's less time to think compared to messages or emails. That's why people often use short expressions to manage the conversation. For example, if they need a moment, they might say, "Let me check," or "Give me 1 second." These are very useful because they give you time without stopping the conversation completely.
I use "hold on a second" all the time, especially if I need to look for information while speaking. And actually, "hold on" is one of those expressions people hear constantly on the phone. Someone says, "Hold on a second, I'll check." And then the conversation continues naturally.
Another very common situation is leaving a voicemail. I think many people dislike voicemails, especially in another language, because you have to speak clearly without immediate interaction. But the structure is usually simple. People say their name, explain why they called, and ask for a call back. For example, "Hi, this is Tom. I was calling about tomorrow's meeting. Call me back when you can."
Yes, and "call me back when you can" is a really useful expression because it sounds natural and relaxed. I also notice that people often slow down slightly when leaving a voicemail. They speak more clearly because they know the other person cannot interrupt or ask questions immediately.
That's true. And another thing that happens often on phone calls is misunderstanding information. Someone might hear the wrong time, the wrong address, or even the wrong name. So people naturally repeat important details. They say things like, "So that's 3 o'clock, right?" Or, "Let me repeat that just to be sure."
Yes, repeating information is very common on the phone. I actually do it a lot because I don't trust phone connections completely, and I think expressions like "just to be sure" or "just to confirm" are extremely useful because they help avoid confusion politely.
Another thing people often do on the phone is multitasking. Sometimes you immediately hear it in the conversation. Someone sounds distracted, or they suddenly say, "Sorry, I'm making coffee at the same time," or "I'm driving right now."
Yes, and I think that's why phone calls often feel less structured than face-to-face conversations. People are moving around, doing other things, or losing focus for a moment. That's also why people use expressions like, "Sorry, what were you saying?" Or, "I lost track for a second."
And honestly, those moments make conversations sound more real. Perfect conversations almost never happen on the phone. There are interruptions, bad connections, distractions, or moments where people misunderstand each other.
Yes, and that's important for learners to remember. Phone conversations are not about speaking perfectly. They are about keeping the interaction moving naturally, even when small problems appear.
Something else that happens a lot on phone calls is making plans or organizing things quickly. People often call because they need an answer immediately, and that changes the rhythm of the conversation. For example, someone might call and say, "Are you free later?" or "Do you want to meet after work?" These questions are very short and direct because the person usually wants a quick response. In my case, I like confirming details clearly on the phone. So if someone suggests meeting somewhere, I naturally repeat the important information. I might say, "Okay, so we're meeting at 7 near the station, right?" That helps avoid confusion later.
I do the same thing, especially because I sometimes forget details if the conversation moves too fast. And honestly, phone calls can move very quickly compared to messages. When people text each other, they have time to read and think. On the phone, you need to react immediately, and that's why people often use very short expressions. Someone might say, "Sounds good," "Perfect," "No problem," or "I'm on my way." These small reactions are everywhere in phone conversations.
Another situation people experience all the time is calling someone while walking outside or traveling somewhere. That's usually when connections become unstable and conversations become less smooth. You suddenly hear expressions like, "Sorry, the signal is bad," or "I'm going into the metro, I might lose you." And "I might lose you" is a very natural expression because it means the call may suddenly stop.
Yes, and people often warn each other before the connection becomes bad. I sometimes say, "My battery is almost dead," or "I don't have much signal here." These little warnings are very common because people want to explain in advance if the call suddenly cuts off.
Another thing I've noticed is how differently people end phone calls depending on the situation. For work calls, people often end quite formally. They say things like, "All right, speak to you later," or "Thanks for your time," or "I'll send you an email afterwards." The ending is polite, but still usually very short.
Phone calls with friends are much more relaxed. Sometimes people spend 2 minutes trying to end the conversation properly. Someone says, "All right, I'll let you go." But then they continue talking again for another minute. I think everybody knows those conversations where both people already said goodbye twice, but the discussion somehow continues.
That's very true. And expressions like "I'll let you go" are extremely common because they politely show that you don't want to keep the other person on the phone for too long.
Another thing people say often before ending a call is, "Keep me posted." That expression is very useful because it means "give me updates" or "let me know what happens."
Yes, and people also say things like "text me when you arrive" or "call me if there's a problem." Phone conversations are often connected to future communication.
Something else I find interesting is that people usually sound more spontaneous on the phone than in messages. When people write messages, they often think carefully before sending them. On the phone, reactions are immediate and sometimes imperfect. That's why you hear pauses, corrections, repeated words, or unfinished sentences much more often.
Yes, and honestly, that's what makes phone conversations difficult but also very real. Nobody speaks perfectly all the time on the phone. People interrupt each other, lose track of what they wanted to say, or suddenly change topic in the middle of the conversation. And I think learners should remember that this is completely normal. A natural conversation is not supposed to sound perfect or rehearsed.
Exactly. The goal is not perfect grammar or perfect pronunciation every second. The goal is understanding, reacting naturally, and keeping the conversation moving.
When you look at all these situations together, what becomes very clear is that phone calls are actually built around very simple English. The difficulty is usually not the vocabulary itself. The difficult part is reacting naturally in real time without seeing the other person. And honestly, that's why phone calls can feel stressful at first, especially in another language. You don't have time to think too much. Someone asks a question, and you immediately need to answer, ask for clarification, or continue the conversation. In my case, I try to keep phone calls organized and clear. I repeat important information, I confirm details, and I try to stay focused on the reason for the call. So if I need to organize something, I naturally use expressions like just to confirm or let me repeat that because they help avoid misunderstandings.
I'm less structured during phone calls, but I think that also makes the conversation feel more relaxed sometimes. I don't always plan what I'm going to say before calling someone. Often I just call and let the conversation happen naturally. And honestly, real phone conversations are rarely perfect. People hesitate, change topics suddenly, forget what they wanted to say, or interrupt themselves halfway through a sentence. That's why I think learners should stop expecting phone conversations to sound perfectly clean and organized. Real conversations are usually a bit messy, even between native speakers.
Another thing I notice is how much tone of voice matters on the phone. Because you can't see the other person, you pay much more attention to how they sound. You immediately notice if someone sounds tired, stressed, busy, relaxed, or happy. And people often comment on that directly. They might say, "You sound tired," or "You sound much better today." These expressions are very common during phone conversations.
Yes, and people also explain what they're doing while talking. Someone says, "Sorry, I'm walking outside," or "I'm still at work," or "I'm making dinner at the same time." Those little details make conversations feel very natural and spontaneous. And actually, phone calls often feel more personal than messages because you hear the person's reactions immediately. You hear them laugh, hesitate, or suddenly become excited about something.
That's true. Messages are usually more controlled, but phone calls feel more alive because everything happens instantly. Another thing that happens often is silence for a few seconds. And interestingly, people usually react to silence immediately on the phone. Someone might suddenly ask, "Are you still there?" Because silence feels different when you can't see the other person.
Yes, and sometimes both people start speaking at the same time, which happens constantly on phone calls. Then one person says, "Sorry, go ahead," and the other says, "No, you first." These small moments happen naturally in real conversations, and they actually make the interaction feel more authentic.
And honestly, that's probably the most important thing to remember about phone calls in English. They are not supposed to sound perfect. There will be interruptions, misunderstandings, pauses, bad connections, and moments where you need someone to repeat something. That happens to everybody.
Exactly. The goal is not to speak perfectly from beginning to end. The goal is to communicate clearly enough to keep the conversation moving naturally. And once you stop trying to sound perfect, phone calls usually become much less stressful.
Before we finish, thank you very much for spending this time with us today.
We hope this conversation helps you feel more comfortable speaking on the phone in English in real-life situations.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe to the channel or share it with someone who is learning English.
It really helps us grow, and we truly appreciate your support.
Join us in the next episode for another calm and practical English conversation.
Thanks again for listening.
And remember, keep speaking English every day.